Zen. Tonight's Dharma talk is given by Robert Koho Epstein.
I'd like to talk about, once again, about my favorite subject tonight, the indecipherable, incomprehensible, uh, relative and absolute. At a time when the relative is extremely rocky, I find it a little bit comforting to contemplate the absolute, even though I don't know if it's really a place that one can go, but let's see. I'll talk a little bit about it in a kind of general way, the relationship of the relative and the absolute, and then I'll concretize it a little bit. And in concretizing it, I may misrepresent it a little bit, but I'm willing to take that risk. And then I'll go into even more detail, which will give me a further opportunity to further misrepresent it. The only thing I can guarantee is that I will attempt at certain points to come in for a landing. So that's not too bad. So I'm sort of perpetually intrigued by how the absolute and the relative intersect with each other, and also how the absolute can feed or support the relative, which I can consider kind of a fruit of practice. And in another sense, how the relative itself expresses the absolute. Since in another sense, the absolute doesn't really have any expression other than as and through the relative, as we point out in the Heart Sutra every week. So how does being in greater touch with the absolute affect the relative? And how does that sense of the absolute in the relative affect our understanding of the absolute? And I might add, and our understanding of the relative. Well, the absolute is like a still point where we can take a breath and find our bearings within the relative. Although to call it a still point is misrepresenting it, because there really isn't anything that is a still point. But leaving that aside, the absolute is somewhat represented by our sitting practice. Since in a sense, we're able to access a relative still point in sitting, where we can come to center and get a more centered and equilibrial, I know that's not a word, equilibrial view of the relative. A little bit as Unsan's quote at the beginning of the meditation session was suggesting. The relative being life itself and everything that we go through and deal with. When we look at our lives from the standpoint of practice, and we find a more centered and mindful way of contemplating our presence in our life, we can get on track in a sense and get ready for the next bout or contest we may be subjected to in our lives. Although, again, it's misrepresenting our relationship to the relative and saying that, because we actually don't have a separate place where we can stop and contemplate anything outside of the flow of the relative, aka samsara. But after all, we really never know what's coming next. And having a kind of a strong anchor in the tathata, the presence of the moment, which is another way of suggesting the presence of the absolute, allows us to go forward into that unknown with a stable, mindful approach, relatively speaking. So that is one way in which we can gain sustenance from the absolute in order to take a sense of it with us and navigate in the relative world of our lives without, of course, overly clinging to the absolute, which would be bad. And in another sense, we can find the absolute in the relative world as well when we're not sitting, but navigating life itself. And the absolute is always represented by everything within the relative, because the absolute is never absent from the relative. The old saying about emptiness and form goes both ways. So I don't mean to separate sitting from life, since it's part of life too in the relative sense. But we do use our sitting to actually practice, to reset, to prepare, and to center ourselves in aware presence. So in that sense, it does give us a handle in the absolute to navigate with. So our practice is both part of the relative world and also a practice, a preparation within the relative world for the rest of life or the rest of the relative. When we recognize the absolute in the relative, we're able to be with whatever's occurring. And a simpler way of saying that would be that when we are mindful of what's happening in the moment and we're connected to what's happening in the moment, we're able to interact with it and connect with it in a different way. Sometimes that's hard. It can be difficult to actually open up to what's happening in the relative, in the changing world of samsara. Sometimes we shy away from a tough reality, and that's also understandable. But sometimes, and perhaps bolstered to a certain extent by practice, we can turn to face the situation and recognize it as just another permutation of the absolute presence of being present, of being here, of being alive and being an aware being. And we can look into the present situation with awareness and be with it, recognize its absolute quality in the face of its relativity. And as I was exchanging with someone the other day, when times are really crazy, not saying they either are or aren't right now, but when times are really crazy, it's a really good opportunity for practice. In a certain way, when we're in a conflict, the relative way or the relative point of view within the relative is to try to resolve it and make the tension go away. But from the absolute standpoint, it's already perfect the way it is, which is a strange thing to say or think from the relative standpoint. But in a certain way, from the absolute standpoint within the relative, by being with the situation and seeing it as itself, as perfectly itself, it may be seen to resolve itself as it inevitably will, one way or another. Those two ways of regarding a life situation, that it should be resolved to restore harmony, the standpoint of the relative, and that it should be given space to resolve itself, the standpoint of the absolute, represent the dynamic of the absolute and the relative. And the absolute view and approach and the relative view and approach, one is not better than the other. And in fact, just as the relative and the absolute support and interpenetrate each other, the absolute approach of just being with a situation and letting it resolve itself, represented by the old Chinese principle of Wu Wei, and the relative approach of interacting with the situation to help resolve it and restore equanimity, both support and interpenetrate each other. And that is the mutually supporting and mutually interpenetrating nature of the relative and the absolute. So there may be one aspect of your relation to a situation that is just being with it and establishing a mindful sense of its absoluteness just as it is, and another aspect of your relation that is actively working on the situation to help resolve it. In fact, to have a balanced dynamic between the absolute and the relative, they both have to be fully integrated at the same time so that your approach is fully integrated and you are unified in your presence and action. Sometimes it seems like we even have to go from one approach to the other and go back and forth between them. One moment being the host who is in dynamic, spontaneous action, and the next moment being the guest who allows the situation to tell her what to do next. And it appears that way because in a given situation, we're in the flow of the relative world. And we have to be prepared to work with both coming forward and stepping back in order to navigate whatever happens next. And that's the introduction. Taking a little closer look at this and taking the risk of running a little long, I'm going to go into yet another aspect of the relationship of the absolute and the relative by very quickly skirting over the most complicated subject in Zen, Dangshan's 5 ranks. So Dangshan is an important figure in the history of Zen, particularly known along with his successor Kaoshan for creating the Cao Dong school, one of those schools, one of the major schools in Chinese Zen. which is also known as the silent illumination school of Zen. Silent illumination stressed silent, deep contemplative sitting practice and was the ancestor of the Soto Zen school. That's just a little introduction to Dongshan, but not 100% pertinent to what I'm going to say next. Dongshan wrote out a set of principles or stages that outline the progression of positions that one might find themselves in along the path of practice. And that highlighted different relationships in one's own understanding of what we sometimes call the absolute and the relative in Zen. So Dongshan, in his 5 positions of absolute and relative, which he called the ruler and minister, or the essential and the contingent, just to make things more confusing. You can pick whatever pair of nouns you like. You can have the absolute and the relative, the ruler and minister, which has a kind of dynamic sense of the relationship, or the essential and the contingent, also sometimes known as essence and function in one application. And these 5 positions show the different experiential positions that these 2 aspects of experiencing could take and a sense of what they represented. And there's a sense in which the final position is seen to be the most awakened and balanced one, but each position has its own quality as well and can sometimes occur in experience at one time or another. So I ran across this translation, which is by Ross Boliter. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of him, but I like it. And it's, and I very much like Dongshan's metaphoric illustrations of the 5 ranks. So I'm just going to take a look at each one of his initial verses as opposed to the commentaries and the commentary verses and the commentaries on the commentary verses, and talk a little bit about each one. So the first rank is the contingent within the essential. And that would also be saying like the relative within the absolute. Contingent and essential can also be called the minister and the ruler. And, you know, those are all synonymous. The contingent within the essential, here's Dongshan's delightful verse in this translation. At the beginning of the 3rd watch, before moonrise, don't be surprised if there is meeting without recognition. One still vaguely harbors the elegance of former days. So again, at the beginning of the 3rd watch, before moonrise, so it's very dark, don't be surprised if there is meeting without recognition. So you don't see the true nature of what you encounter. One still vaguely harbors the elegance of former days. So one is attached to the ways in which one thinks or conceptualizes about things, possibly about the absolute principle itself. So there's a sense of that while one is dwelling in the essential or absolute, one doesn't really recognize it and is seeing it within the darkness of the relative. So the next position is the essential within the contingent. The essential within the contingent, having overslept, an old woman encounters the ancient mirror. This is clearly meeting face to face. Only then is it genuine. Don't lose your head by validating shadows. So you may be led astray by the impression of things within form, objects and things which you have conceptualized to separate them out or make them appear real. But you have had a direct meeting with the essence of things, with your understanding of what the nature of things is. In the 3rd position is arriving within the essential. And the verse is, in nothingness, there is a road apart from the dust. If you don't break the taboo on mentioning the emperor's name, you will surpass the eloquence of the previous dynasty's worthies who cut off tongues. So that suggests that if you don't even need to only have silence by not talking about and conceptualizing the principle, but you're doing more than just refusing to speak about something in order to refrain from conceptualizing it. You're seeing that there's a road that leads to the essential, within the relative. After that, the next position is approaching from the contingent. No need to dodge when blades are crossed. The skillful one is like a lotus in the midst of fire. Seemingly, you yourself possess the aspiration to soar to the heavens. So this is saying that once you're a bit rooted in the essential, you're able to fully confront and engage with the contingent. And finally, there is arriving at concurrence, where the essential and the contingent, or the absolute and the relative, are balanced and fully integrated. Who would presume to join their voice with someone who has surpassed there is and there is not? Everyone longs to leave the mundane stream. Bye-bye, samsara. Yet finally you return to sit in the charcoal heap. So the final position doesn't avoid reality at all. You no longer separate yourself from the stream of samsara, but you just are very happy to hang out in it because you realize that it's not necessary to fight the nature of things. You can be part of it, and you're in harmony. And that also reminds me of the 10th ox herding picture, where the fully realized sage returns to the marketplace dressed in rags and is perfectly happy. And they say that everywhere he or she goes, flowers bloom. So you're poor, you're not hanging on to anything, you're just an ordinary person, you're not aspiring to anything anymore, but the quality of your presence is fully illuminating. So when there's no longer a distinction between the absolute, aka the awakened presence or the awakened mind, and the particularity of experience in the world, it's no longer necessary to either run away to a transcendent state or to reduce your understanding to raw experience in the world. The simple experience of anything is the experience of the absolute, and there's no place to go, or no place that you need to go. And it also reminds me to finish off of one of my favorite koans from the book of Equanimity. It has another more common name, but I forgot it for the moment. The Book of Equanimity, where Buddha and a disciple are walking along. This may be in some other collections too. And the Buddha sees a really beautiful open field, and he says, this would be a wonderful place to build a temple. And the disciple, I forget which one it was, picks a blade of grass and sticks it in the ground and says, there, the temple is built.